All right. Okay, well, thank you. Everybody can hear me okay?
Mhm.
All right, great. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Jørgen, to the Center for American Studies at SDU, and to the U.S. Embassy in Denmark. I'm so happy to participate, and I am grateful to my colleagues in Denmark, who I really adore, for their continued support of my work. I am going first today because I have to present, take a few questions, and then jump off because we are running to the airport. So I apologize. So I want to talk today um, about war. And I find it telling that by addressing war, I might actually sound somewhat anachronistic to those interested in this presidential election. And I hope that such disinterest is actually a good sign. Nevertheless, I want to remind us of an opportunity that has presented itself with the end of the US war in Afghanistan. The conclusion to that conflict has marked a conclusion to a certain kind of American war thinking. And when an intellectual tradition ends, new ways of thinking can breathe again. One way to consider the moment we are in is to recall what followed the Vietnam War. Vietnam effectively ended the use of containment as an organizing idea for American war making. Both Korea and Vietnam were products of containment. Korea ended in a stalemate, and of course, Vietnam was a failure. After Vietnam, a moral vacuum opened, with a variety of ideas vying to be an alternative to containment. I think the idea that won out is just war. And we've been living with this approach to war thinking ever since. The thinker most closely associated with the rise of just war immediately after Vietnam is political theorist Michael Walzer. In his 1977 book, Just and Unjust Wars, Walzer transformed almost overnight into a sage on war. Even though Walzer had opposed the war in Vietnam, he proposed that any country might have legitimate reasons to go to war. His innovation, and the thing that made his work a touchstone for presidents, pundits, and professors alike, has been his emphasis on a common set of terms under which any war should be fought. Those terms served a specific purpose for Walzer. He argued that appealing to and following the rules of just war would help America avoid another Vietnam. His hope was to make America less exceptional. Just war might help the global superpower act like it had a conscience. Walzer, however, was not the only party interested in the power of just war. President Jimmy Carter was clearly inspired by the theory in his famous address at the University of Notre Dame, in which he proclaimed America's commitment to human rights as part of its foreign policy. The most significant moment in the rise of just war came in 1983, when a debate erupted over a pastoral letter from the US Catholic bishops entitled The Challenge of Peace. The majority of bishops endorsed a critique of Ronald Reagan's bellicose foreign policy, finding his rattling of nuclear weapons to be especially dangerous. Contesting the bishops was an emerging alliance of conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants. They feared the potential of just war to temper American military might in its ideological and military standoff against the Soviet Union. This coalition of conservative religious elites was unique and influential. It foreshadowed and aided the rise of neoconservatism, a movement dedicated to rebuilding American moral authority. From the mid 1980s through the election of Barack Obama, every war America fought was a just war. The language of just war was all over presidential speeches, addresses to the UN, and in countless op-eds and essays from the Wall Street Journal to the New Republic. The use of just war was bipartisan. H.W. Bush used it to defend the troop buildup in the Persian Gulf. Bill Clinton used it to rationalize bombing in the Balkans. And W used it repeatedly in his campaigns to defend the United States and presumably the world from terrorism, the axis of evil, and non-existent weapons of mass destruction. In 2008, Barack Obama ran and won the presidency, repudiating neocon wars, but not the use of just war. He used just war in his Nobel Peace Prize speech, and he based his defense on drone attacks on just war principles. While many contest how much Barack Obama broke with the neocons, he clearly believed that using the language of just war, if not necessarily abiding by its principles, made his country safer and the world less angry at the United States. So what does this pocket history of just war thinking tell us? First, and I think the most important thing to remember, is that the appeal of just war after Vietnam came from its utility as a moral alternative to Cold War realism. Just war promised to bring a moral calculus to America war making. Surveys at the time showed that Americans wanted assurance that their country might still be able to fight a good war. While the neocons won the morality wars in the 1980s and 1990s, using just war to rebuild American moral authority, their time has passed. Their moral arguments have failed. We can see how successive presidents, from Obama to Trump to Biden, ran against the adventurism of neocons, just as their predecessors ran against the disasters of containment. Second, and perhaps more telling, that recent polls indicate a new moral vacuum has opened up after Afghanistan. Since 1975, just war placed morality at the center of American war thinking, and younger Americans appear ready to pass judgment on just war's utility as a moral compass. These polls suggest that younger Americans question the importance of the military. All right. In fact, it's one of the lowest, the rates of trust in the military is one of the lowest it's been since 1980. They're skeptical about the effectiveness of American power. And it's interesting, again, that this distinction, while in some ways it leans more towards Democrats than Republicans, it's still, the younger generation is still an outlier compared to older generations. And they are ready to set limits on an American purpose in the world. It appears to me that another round of morality wars might soon ignite, but this time perhaps just war will operate as a means of restraint rather than a means to make war. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Very big thank you to Professor Haberski, and if there's any questions, we have some time to take them. Well, I think that your presentation was so all-inclusive that everyone under. Oh, we do have one question. I apologize.
That's fine. Oh man, sort of like class where
as a person who's old enough to have a draft number, I've often thought that that the reintroduction of the draft would be a good idea in the United States for promoting a more egalitarian society and more democracy and a more thoughtful foreign policy. I'm just curious what you have to say about that.
Yeah, it's a great point. So around the same time that Walzer's writing his book, the military is coming out with the total force strategy, the total force policy, which basically eliminated the idea of a draft, but made it necessary if the president or Congress declared war, that the National Guard would be called up. So it was this idea to avoid sort of the population getting involved in war, but forcing some referendum on the popularity of the war, because there would be civilians in a certain way, people who had volunteered to go into the Guard, they would be called up and be part of the fighting force. So you're right that there was a very hot debate immediately after Vietnam about what to do with the draft. Every once in a while, you see that pop up again. I don't see it being something that at least the younger generation today is much interested in when they are evaluating the moral value of policies and the way that I think leadership thinks about war.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time again. We really enjoyed having you here, and we're really sad to see you go so soon. But hopefully next time you will have a little longer to stay with us, and we will enjoy it once again.
Well, thanks so much. I hope to actually physically be there at some point in the near future.
And
all right, thanks everyone. Good to see you, Laura. Good to see Andrew. Bye, Niels and Jörn.
And it is with great pleasure that I'm introducing our next speaker, Professor Laura Browder from Richmond, Virginia. Is that right?
Yeah.
That is correct. So just a couple of words about Professor Browder. She's the granddaughter of Earl Browder, who ran twice for presidency in the United States under the Communist Party, USA. And she has been writing a book about her dearly beloved grandfather. Release date to be announced, I think. Yes, so we have not had official confirmation about that, but we are excited for your new book. And she lived in Denmark for several years in her childhood, and she speaks fluent Danish. So for all of you Danes, this is a wonderful opportunity to talk to her in your native languages. She holds a PhD in English and American literature from Brandeis University. She has several publications and exhibitions in her CV, and her grants, awards, and fellowships only take up 2.5 pages in her curriculum vitae, which is, I think, speaks very highly of an incredible career. And Professor Browder, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Oh, you've got to turn on the sharing.
Why is my buttons not? Am I working? Okay, here we go. All right, you are now the co-host and you should be able to share.
Perfect. All right, let's see. So today, I'm going to talk about, sorry, I just need to enter full screen. Here we go. I'm going to talk about an issue which has loomed unusually large in this particular election cycle, and that is the question of gender. And that's why I've called my talk Chasing the Bro Vote, because really Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have been engaged in a fierce battle over a very particular demographic, young white men. So Trump, of course, wanted to attract everyone, but shockingly, his appeal to women has not been particularly successful. So he has announced in all capital letters that once he's elected, women will no longer have to be thinking about abortion. He's promised to protect them at a level never seen before. They will finally be healthy, hopeful, safe, and secure. Their lives will be happy, beautiful, and great again. And shockingly, this did not go over well with women. And his choice of running mate has been particularly problematic because it seems like every few minutes, another horrible quote from J.D. Vance's past comes up because he's been on the media, in the media a lot since Hillbilly Elegy was published. So he discussed the purpose of the postmenopausal female, which was to take care of her grandchildren so we wouldn't need childcare anymore. And of course, the left has been all over him. And here he is talking with Tucker Carlson about this terrible attack on him. And the attack has taken many forms. It started with his infamous remarks about childless cat ladies. And that spawned many, many memes, cats against J.D. Vance. And it's prompted Taylor Swift, perhaps the most famous childless cat lady, to come out strongly in support of Kamala Harris. So given this loss with women voters, the Trump campaign has been courting younger men, especially young white men, very hard. So these are men under 50, but of course, especially the really younger ones under 30. So Democrats have had a problem attracting young white men ever since Hillary Clinton's campaign. So Hillary Clinton built her entire 2016 presidential campaign around the idea that she was a pioneer breaking the highest, hardest glass ceiling of sexism. She was known for being part of the pantsuit nation, and here she is with a couple of her other pantsuit wearers. And most infamously, she is known for her remarks about Trump voters being a basket of deplorables. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. And unfortunately, there are people like that, and he has lifted them up. And you could imagine how that went over with white working class voters. They made T-shirts, proud member of the basket of deplorables. And as I'm sure we all remember very vividly, Hillary lost the election in a landslide. And a lot of that had to do with white working class men voting for Trump. So in this campaign, because the gender split has at times been over 50% of a division, with young men backing Trump by 13 points and young women favoring Harris by 38 points, the Trump allies have been launching a huge effort to reach young men, partnering with entertainers and sports figures, including, of course, wrestling, cage fighting, all kinds of very sort of macho activities and niches. So he's been courting conservative male influencers to try to reach younger men. And here is one example of the Nelk brothers, a conservative influencer, holding up his can of tobacco and saying that if Harris is elected, there will be a 95% tax on smokeless tobacco. So this is a very particular appeal to a very specific group. Elon Musk, of course, has been very much in the mix, and he has put, I think at this point, it's been about $10 million into campaign ads promoting Trump for young men. And here is one of his ads where he talks about if you sit this election out and you see this kind of tired, limp, pizza-eating, disheveled guy just hanging out on a couch, you could either be part of this demographic or you could align with an American badass. So the machismo of the Trump campaign has been on full display, especially at the Republican National Convention, where fighter Hulk Hogan appeared, much to Trump's approval, and ripped his shirt apart to reveal a Trump Vance tank top underneath, just as a show of his masculinity. So this has been what Kamala Harris has been up against, this kind of super masculine approach. But unlike Hillary Clinton, who had no clue of how to appeal to young white men, Harris and her allies have been extremely savvy. There's a Geeks and Nerds for Harris group that has raised a lot of money. And of course, there are white dudes for Harris, which we'll talk about in a moment. So she has even created ads that use the Republican, very notorious Project 2025, which the Democrats have successfully framed as a blueprint for Trump's proposed administration. They've created an ad in this gamer language, Trump's end game for total control. They've used camo hats. Viral Harris Waltz camo hats riff on red state style and draw ire of NRA. So they're using the fashion choices of the right to appeal to Democrats. And that's a twist that has made Republicans very uneasy. So here is an ad that the Lincoln Project, which is Republicans who hate Trump and are supporting Harris, made to appeal specifically to white men. And you can see here is a kind of iconic American farmer walking through his field of grain. And the framework here is that Kamala Harris actually possesses many more of the masculine virtues than Trump does. She has more courage, more honor, and honor is always something that's associated with men, right? Women have virtue, men have honor. And she's got more guts than this guy ever had. So she's shown in a martial setting, surrounded by members of the military. And here is Trump looking kind of weak. So the ad is very direct. You decide, are we really going back down that same fucking broken road? Or are we going towards hope, towards freedom, towards change? And you can see here's a macho dad on his motorcycle with his two young sons, and he's up for Kamala Harris, and he's against a red background, which again is always associated with Republicans. So what the hell are you waiting for? Because if it's the woman thing, and here they are addressing directly the fact that the US has never had a female president, and that perhaps many men are very uneasy about the idea of voting for a woman. It's time to get over that. It's time to be a man and vote for a woman. So in this great rhetorical turn, the ad premises manhood on the courage to vote for Kamala Harris. So that's a really new twist. And the Harris campaign, after Trump's disastrous debate with Harris, has started trolling him and accusing him of cowardice for not wanting to have a second campaign. So this ad was broadcast during a college football game recently, and it contains so many signs and signifiers of masculinity, starting, of course, with these football players. And the ad says that winners never back down, and that Kamala Harris and any other winner is ready to engage anytime, any place. Contrast with this is this kind of sad, schlumpy looking picture of Trump on this kind of boring, flat golf course all by himself. And the text says Trump is now refusing to debate a second time, and triggered Trump self-destructs, bumbles into Harris's debate traps. Now, the right has long accused people on the left of being easily triggered, right? And so by turning that rhetoric against Trump, Harris is trying to successfully rattle him the way she did in the actual debate, which was all about triggering him and insinuating that he is not as tough, strong, and popular as he claims to be. And her slogan is, let's get back to work. And this is part of the White Dudes for Harris campaign. Now, there are a lot of white dudes for Harris and even old white men for Harris, and they too have launched a huge ad buy. And they've hired Sam Elliott, who is kind of an iconic Western-looking actor, to do the voiceover. And this message is, if anything, even more direct than the Lincoln Project's. Hey, white dudes. It addresses the fact that young white men and older white men feel defensive and are constantly being told that they suck and that we white men are the problem. So some white dudes are the problem, the ad says. So it tries to create a distinction between the good white dudes and the bad white dudes. And the interesting thing about the bad white dudes is that they're not even all dudes, right? You can see Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert, along with, Vance and Trump, and I think that's Carlson, over there. So the idea is that these are losers, right? They're not really strong men. The Harris campaign, on the other hand, is talking to guys like us, right? And she's not lecturing, because Hillary Clinton was accused all the time of lecturing and hectoring and talking down to people, condescension. So instead, Kamala Harris is appealing to a different kind of manhood. And it's a manhood that is all about being a great dad, being there for your family. He's not out trashing the US Capitol and rioting. He is taking his position as the father of the family. And here is a uniformed service member who is also a dad and taking care of his family. So I wanted to stop this. Do I stop the share now? Will that work? Or should I stay on it? I don't know. Anyway, I wanted to end this by, of course, welcoming questions, but also saying what I should have said right at the beginning of this talk, which is that I am so appreciative of being here and of everything that SDU has done. And thank you to the American Embassy for its support of this conference. And I really do miss all of my wonderful colleagues at SDU. So it's good to see you all again, and thank you. And thank you especially to the student organizers who I know did so much to put this event together. So now, if anyone has any questions, I am super happy to take them.
We have a couple of questions. First, right over here. Here we go.
Thank you. I guess my question goes that like historically, young voters have not been like turning out. But I'm not sure about recent elections actually. But anyway, what my question goes basically like how important is like it seems that they're fighting really hard for these young voters, but how important is this actually in the greater picture of the election, would you say?
It is hugely important because the polls are showing it to be an extremely tight race. And, a huge part of Obama's win in 2008 and 2012 was young voters. So Harris needs to get every constituency that she can. And if Democrats write off young male voters, they're really going to be in a lot of trouble. They can't afford to do that.
Okay, and we have a question from Thomas.
Thank you, Laura. This is your old colleague, Thomas.
Hi, Thomas.
Hey, so thank you so much. I'm wondering about how successful you think Democrats have been in sort of catering to not just young men, but men in general, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, right? I think 2/3 of those jobs went to working class men. But it seems as if the Democrats can't sort of state that publicly. It seems they're afraid that, it will be seen as a zero-sum game. They don't want to push away women voters. So it's still, to me, it seems there's still this tendency to be afraid to sort of openly say, well, we acknowledge that some men feel that they're being overlooked, et cetera. You can look at various suicide statistics and so on, right? So how do you think that figures in that way of not addressing it openly? Thank you.
I think that you raise a really good point. And, they are walking really a tightrope in trying to not turn off women, but also appeal to men. And I think one way that they've been really smart about this has been appealing to union members, right? Because a lot of them are male. And the Biden administration certainly, and Kamala Harris in particular as well, have done a huge amount of outreach to organized labor. So I think that's a big part of it. And the second part of it is that Harris has an amazing social media rapid response team, which is left largely unsupervised. And basically, it's a bunch of 25-year-olds, right? Who, whenever Trump or Vance says something, or whenever something relevant comes up in the news, they immediately shoot out, memes and TikToks and all kinds of things to really address the very online population, which includes a lot of young men. So I think that she's just trying everything that she possibly can, because, the great triumph of the Trump administration, one of them was to say, toxic masculinity is not toxic. It's really strong masculinity. So if you want to make demeaning comments about women, if you want to trash immigrants, it's just all part of being a guy. And he has surrounded himself, right? I mean, Trump has also made a lot of derogatory comments about service members. And, Harris, on the other hand, is really cultivating that constituency. I think she's had an incredibly disciplined campaign as far as this goes.
All right, we have a question from Jørgen Brøndal.
Hej Laura, dejligt at se dig igen. Tak. I'll switch to the English language, of course. And so wonderful to see you, and also wonderful to see Andrew and Ray. Absolutely fabulous. My question is about young African American and young Hispanic men, because it would seem that at least during a phase of the campaign, they've been moving towards the Republican Party. So I'd just like to hear your take on that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's been really striking. And I think it's hard to know how deep the support is, right? I mean, I think Trump has been savvy in some ways, but he's also been trying to appeal to young Black men by saying, hey, I'm a felon too. We're all felons. Isn't that great? We can relate to one another. He's sometimes really tone deaf. So I actually don't think that young men who are Black and brown are going to turn out for Trump in big numbers. I mean, I agree. It's not the same strong degree of Black male support and Latino male support that it has been in the past. But, in the remaining weeks of the campaign, a lot of things could happen because Trump is rhetorically out of control now.
Yeah, and before we move on, Professor Browder, I also had a question. Do you want to hear again? And my question was, you seem to know that the Kamala Harris, her team has started to utilize TikTok as a platform to reach out to a lot of young people. And I also noticed that they use the Brett Girl Summer motive a lot, which I think mainly... which I think mainly speaks to younger women and gay men demographics. Do you think that was a deliberate choice on her team's behalf against the Trump campaign trying to grasp the younger male audiences?
Well, I love that question, first of all. And second of all, I think her embrace of Brett Summer came about because she was really surprised at how that caught on. And you remember initially the Trump campaign was showing all these ads of Kamala laughing and Kamala dancing to say she can't be a serious person. Look at her. Here she is dancing in this drum line. Her laugh is so ominous. There was a lot of that rhetoric. And what Brett Summer did was to turn that around and to say Kamala's really cool and hip, right? She's a brat, like all of us, and to bring kind of humor and joy to the campaign as much as possible. So I think, the truth is that given the tightness of the election, she has got to grab every single demographic that she can. And I will be really curious to see how Brett Summer and Taylor Swift play out for young men, right? Will they be turned off because of that? Taylor Swift has a very, very female audience, right? So I think we are all going to be on the edge of our seats on election night and probably for many days thereafter, seeing what worked and what didn't work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that answer. And since we don't have any other questions, oh, yeah, we do. Well, I wasn't the last one then.
Thank you. That was very interesting. As you said, Taylor Swift has a huge audience and it's mainly female. So in your opinion, if you could sort of your dream pick of some guy endorsing Kamala Harris, who would that be?
Oh my gosh, that is a great question to which I will probably come up with the answer at 3 a.m. tonight.
A sports star, LeBron James, somebody who?
Well, she has started athletes for Harris. And so Magic Johnson is now in the mix. I think Steph Curry is now in the mix. Okay. She is now really reaching out to a lot of athletes, black and white, male and female, Billie Jean King, the tennis player who so famously beat Bobby Riggs in the 70s, right? She's in the mix as well. So I think, yes, athletes, entertainers, the Big Lebowski hosted a big fundraiser for her and raised tens of millions of dollars. So I think she is just trying to appeal to as many constituencies as she can in an as long way as possible. Oh, I see a question in the chat. Do you think that the gender gap we're seeing in politics has more to do with men becoming more conservative or women becoming more liberal? I think it's really been both. And I think we see that most strongly in this election, right? I think it's the biggest gap that it's been since people started paying attention to gender and politics in our presidential elections. I think Trump managed very successfully to address young men and to say all the things that you feel like you can't say because, everyone is so politically correct, quote unquote. All the things that are true, again, the racism, the sexism, et cetera. With me, you can say them out loud, and I'm going to say them out loud. So he really appealed to, I'd say, the worst natures of young white men who felt disenfranchised, disempowered. And it has been a winning playbook for him, but I think that's changing now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Browder. We really enjoyed your presentation and the Q&A section. And thank you for our Zoom question as well. This was the first that we've had, and we really, really appreciated it. And then last and definitely not least, I would like to welcome Professor Andrew Hartman as our last speaker for the pre-election events. And please don't forget that the events will continue during the election because we're hosting election night and then after the elections as well, or the election. Professor Hartman got his PhD in history from George Washington University, and he's a former Fulbright Distinguished Chair of the American Studies at SDU Odense, right here where we are today. He's currently a professor of history at Illinois State University, and he also notes several publications, including 3 books and a podcast called Trotsky and the Wild Orchids, which I think you mentioned you've put on a brief pause, but you're looking into starting again. Is that correct?
I hope so, yes.
Wonderful, great. So we're going to look out for that. And currently he's finishing up a book about Karl Marx in America, further dates to be announced, I guess. And with that said, Professor Hartman, welcome and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's really great to be here. I love the Center for American Studies at SDU. Really loved my time in Odense and honestly wish I was there with you all right now. So I'm a historian, not a political scientist, not a pundit, not a prognosticator. So sometimes I'm a little bit uncomfortable commenting on current events such as the upcoming US presidential election, but of course, I do have opinions. But more to the point, as a historian of the recent United States, and as someone who has written a book on the history of the culture wars and has a new book out on Karl Marx in America, which includes a bunch of research on the recent history of capitalism and labor, I have ideas about the historical forces at play in this election. So in the contest between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, there are many historical forces at work that are shaping the campaign and the probable results. But more important, what I'm interested in is shaping the meaning or significance of it all. It's always a weird task to predict how future historians will think about contemporary events. We don't know what's going to happen in the future that will determine their interpretations. But I do not think I'm going out on a limb when I claim that 2 historical forces stand out to me as overdetermined in this political system: the culture wars and neoliberalism. So those will be the 2 topics that shape the convo today. First, the culture wars. These are the dramatic struggles which have pitted liberal, progressive, and secular Americans against their conservative, traditional, and religious counterparts, and which captured the attention of the US during the 1980s and 1990s. So these are battles over, these battles that emerged over what constitutes art and over whether the federal government should subsidize art that insults the most cherished beliefs of millions of Americans, over transgressive films and television shows, and over whether insensitive cultural programming should be censored, over the public schools, and over whether American children should learn divisive subjects like evolutionary biology, over the university curriculum, and over whether American college students should read a traditional Western canon or texts that represent a more diverse range of perspectives, over how the nation's history is narrated in museums, and over whether the purpose of American history is to make Americans proud of their nation's glorious past or to encourage citizens to reflect on its moral failings. So, for a period of about 2 decades, the culture wars, almost like a vortex, swallowed up much of American political and cultural life. This fight over what it means to be an American was what I call the defining metaphor for the late 20th century in the United States. And so this was the topic of my last book titled A War for the Soul of America. It tried to make sense of that history. When I was writing the conclusion to that book, it was 2014. In fact, I wrote the conclusion while I was living in Odense, mostly at a coffee shop called Nella's. I hope that coffee shop is still in existence. I really liked it there. It's a good place to write. When I was writing that conclusion in 2014, was before Donald Trump had announced his run for presidency, I argued that the logic of the culture wars had been exhausted and that the metaphor had run its course. This forecast was not the product of naivety. No self-respecting historian could pretend to believe that Americans had come to a peaceful consensus on the issues that had polarized the nation since the 1960s. These issues might sound familiar to anyone who has read at all about the culture wars or thought about them: abortion, affirmative action, controversial art and censorship, evolution, feminism, gay rights, multiculturalism, national history standards, pornography, school prayer, sex education. That's just to name a few. So I understood that cultural conflict would persist as it has throughout American history, but I suggested, again, writing in 2014, that such conflict was now being fought in a different register, one that was shaped by the ever intensifying disruptions that neoliberalism had been wreaking on American life. Trump's ascendance complicated that prognosis. Make America great again. This is definitely a slogan of a culture warrior. It evokes the fervent belief among many Americans that the nation is no longer theirs. Once upon a time, this slogan deftly implies things in America made sense. Right and wrong were distinguishable, hard work was rewarded, people respected authority, love of country was widely shared, as was faith in God. But this familiar America, this like what I call normative America, now seems upside down in the eyes of millions of the nation's citizens. Since Trump was elected in 2016, the culture wars have thrived. I could give lots of examples: the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the ongoing controversy over transgenderism. There are many. But I'll focus briefly on the one most relevant to my profession, the history wars. There's a heated debate going on now over how US history should be taught. Although this sort of larger war for American history has been ongoing really since the nation's founding, the current iteration arguably started in 2019 with publication of the 1619 Project. This is a Pulitzer Prize winning curriculum produced by the New York Times that places slavery at the heart of American history. The 1619 Project's call for an intensified focus on race aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement. The millions of people who filled streets to protest George Floyd's murder by police in the summer of 2020 guaranteed that the 1619 Project would have a large and passionate audience. Yet, by recentering the American historical narrative around race, which has never been an agreeable topic in the United States, at a time, 2020, when the nation's collective nerves were frayed by the incitements of the Trump administration and the anxieties of a global pandemic, while the New York Times also ensured a highly polarized response. In contrast with the favorable attention that the 1619 Project has received in liberal circles, conservatives like Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton have described the curriculum as, quote, anti-American rot. In the waning days of his administration, Trump commissioned a group of right-wing operatives to respond to the 1619 Project by creating a curriculum of its own. The Trump Commission's 1776 report was roundly criticized by historians for ignoring a half-century of historical scholarship. But professional criticism of the Trump administration's attempt at constructing its own ideologically motivated curriculum, well, this hardly ended the history war. In the past few years, right-wing activists have flooded local school board meetings, angrily denouncing race-focused curriculum as psychologically harmful to white children. Florida governor and very short-term Republican presidential candidate Ron DeSantis launched a war on wokeness, which is much derided slang for, among other things, alertness to racial injustice. DeSantis pushed through legislation that forbids his state schools from teaching about institutional racism. So I don't want to give the impression that conservatives are the only ones fighting the culture wars. If you lived in the US and you flipped on MSNBC at any time, day or night, you would learn that the latest misdeeds committed by Trump and his legion of followers, whom Hillary Clinton notoriously referred to as the basket of deplorables, well, you would learn that they're doing something awful, and you would learn that it's always pitched in this us versus them framework. So the culture wars are always fought on terrain, or we might say beachheads, established by left and liberal movements. Without the worldwide attention that the Black Lives Matter movement brought to racial injustice and police brutality, there probably is no current history war. But conservative politicians, certainly including Trump, seem to thrive in the culture war swamps. Trump thrives in the chaos and anger, which is why he remains the nation's culture warrior in chief, and why that is unlikely to change whether he wins or loses this upcoming election. And I would say especially if he once again resists or denies the results of the election. For Trump, a presidential election is just another scrum in the culture wars. None of which is to say that the Trump campaign does not have a particular message, or that the Trump era does not have a particular theme beyond the culture wars. Trump has weirdly been waging a war against neoliberalism. I would call it a cold war against neoliberalism because he speaks a mean game and presents himself as ideologically opposed to neoliberalism. But as president, he did not do too much to confront or overturn several decades of neoliberal power. So neoliberalism, what is this term? It's a hotly contested term that many people think is the product of overblown left-wing or Marxist rhetoric. But I would argue we need words to describe things, and I think neoliberalism is a useful term. So let me define and historicize it just a bit. In the 1970s, a somewhat stable, regulated version of capitalism began its death spiral. That system, forever linked with the New Deal reforms that helped usher in capitalism's golden age, was replaced piece by piece by a highly volatile system of capitalism that came to be called neoliberalism. I would argue it's perhaps best to consider neoliberalism a philosophy that has reshaped the political economy of capitalism since the 1970s. Neoliberalism's signature principle is that capitalist markets better serve people than government, and thus government should serve capitalist markets. So neoliberalism relegated the public good ethos that had reluctantly shaped American governments since the 1930s. Well, it relegated that to the dustbins of history. In some ways, Trump is the quintessential neoliberal politician. He rose to fame and riches thanks to weakened government regulations and lack of oversight that allowed a shady business dealer to thrive. Only in a culture that shamelessly celebrates wealth and that elevates the status of a so-called entrepreneur, even if the entrepreneur in question is a huckster, well, only in such a culture would a reality television program like The Apprentice be popular. And only in a neoliberal political culture that denigrates public service and government employment could an unqualified and inexperienced private sector figure like Trump capture one of the two major political parties and indeed the White House. All that said, Trump also rode to power on a wave of disaffection with neoliberalism. The reporter Christian Parenti traveled the campaign trail with Trump in 2016, undertaking a close reading of every one of his campaign speeches during that election, and came to a somewhat surprising conclusion. Yes, Trump sometimes talked about building a wall to bar dangerous immigrants from Mexico and Central America, sounding like a deranged 19th century nativist. This is something he, of course, continues to do, and which should be noted is a breach with neoliberal doctrine, since immigration ensures a cheap labor force. Yes, Trump often spoke during the 2016 campaign about nasty liberals, treasonous Democrats. He continues to do this. But Parenti kept score and noted that those messages were far secondary to his anti-neoliberal economic messaging. Parenti described the, quote, mind-bending experience of watching a reality TV freak articulate surprisingly subversive political truths about the economy. As Trump told one audience in New Hampshire, we're going to bring businesses back. We're going to have businesses that used to be in New Hampshire that are now in Mexico come back to New Hampshire. And you can tell them to go fuck themselves because they let you down and they left. The they in this equation are the corporations and the neoliberal politicians who enabled the offshoring of jobs. Trump often used NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that Bill Clinton signed into law in 1994, and Clinton did this as the crown jewel of the neoliberal era, and which put the final nail in the coffin of the American industrial heartland. Trump often brought up NAFTA during the 2016 election campaign as a rallying cry. And this was effective, particularly because he was running against a Clinton who ended up losing key states in the industrial Midwest, including Wisconsin and Michigan, which ensured her defeat. As president, Trump was erratic about everything, of course, that's Trump, but he was erratic when it comes to economic policy. He did not sign any new free trade deals, including the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Obama had brokered, but which the US never signed into law. He raised tariffs, especially for China, which went against the neoliberal grain. But he also enacted new and deep tax cuts for the wealthy, not exactly a departure from the neoliberalism, which almost always benefits the rich and punishes the working class. But that one of Trump's selling points was resistance to neoliberalism, I think, signals a potential break. There are a few other signs. The surprising success of Bernie Sanders' renegade campaigns against the billionaires and the 1% in both 2016 and 2020 signaled that there is a growing constituency on the left for resistance to neoliberalism. As was often noted during Bernie's campaign, his ideal society was Scandinavian social democracy. He often talked about Denmark, which, though not immune to the pressures of neoliberalism, has weathered them better than the United States. Another even more palpable sign that neoliberalism might be breathing its dying breath is the economic record of the Biden administration. Joe Biden, representing for most of his career the state of Delaware, and more importantly, the financial industries which have set up shop in that state due to its favorable tax and investment climate. Well, Biden was a career neoliberal politician. In fact, he is the last person I would have expected to break with neoliberal doctrine as president. And yet, due to the shifting political winds, that is precisely what Biden has done in the last 4 years as president. His support for labor-friendly policies, which is anathema to neoliberalism, has led some of the most renowned labor historians to declare him the best labor president in the history of the United States. This is a really remarkable turn. In 2021, Biden promised, quote, that he would be the most pro-union president leading the most pro-union administration in American history. He's come close to upholding that promise, a rarity in American politics at a time when organized labor is finally, after 5 decades of decline, clawing its way back to prominence with a number of high-profile strikes in the last 4 years. Unions are popular with the American public for the first time since the 1960s. Biden even became the first president to join workers on a picket line. I would argue that if it were not for other problems that his administration has suffered from, including his advanced age and evident cognitive decline, the inflation that has bedeviled his administration, and more recently, Israeli policies which have alienated young potential Democratic voters, old Uncle Joe would have been a shoo-in to win re-election. Alas. The 2024 campaign has not given us such indelible signals. Trump has sort of backed away from his 2016 economic populist message, focusing more than ever on the border and culture war issues like the fear of transgenderism. And as Laura made clear, just sort of machismo politics. Rather than an eat cake message, he's turned to an eat cats and dogs message. The Harris campaign has been vaguely pro-worker in its message. Using Tim Walz as was an encouraging anti-neoliberal sign since he has governed Minnesota as a mild social democrat. But it seems the Harris campaign, in what I would consider repeating one of the chief mistakes of the 2016 Clinton campaign, is also working overtime to win over suburban Republicans who have been disaffected by Trump's vulgarities. For example, the Harris campaign has been cozying up to Dick Cheney as of late. This might work in the short term. Maybe it will help Harris win the Electoral College. I think that's a big maybe. But to me, it also represents a troubling long-term development. We're now in the midst of a class realignment when it comes to the political parties. The richest zip codes in the United States, places like Bethesda, Maryland, and suburban DC, are now some of the most reliably Democratic districts. And the working class, which has consistently and reliably voted Democratic since 1932, with a few dips here and there, such as in the 1980s during the Reagan era, this working class is more and more voting Republican. A recent poll just from last week shows that Trump has the most working class support of any Republican candidate since Reagan, and maybe even more than that. And it's not just the white working class that liberals have scaremongered about since Trump was elected, and which was discussed in the Q&A with Laura. Trump has also made serious inroads with Black and brown working class Americans, and I don't think this is superficial. I have my theories about why this is. I'm happy to discuss that in the Q&A, but suffice to say, it's a troubling development for those like me and maybe others in the room, who want a multicultural, anti-nativist, feminist political culture. So those of us on the left side of the culture wars, coupled with an anti-neoliberal, social democratic, or even socialist economic agenda. The way things are trending, neither political party seems likely to offer that combined agenda, even though I think there were signs of it under Biden. On the flip side, I think the path is clear for a Republican majority based on a combination of cultural nationalism and economic populism or anti-neoliberalism. I highly doubt Trump will be the person to bring the GOP to that place. It will require a special politician and a unique coalition capable of taming powerful corporate interests. But the turn against neoliberalism, to me, makes it seem at least possible. My perhaps naive hope is that lots of young, left-leaning Americans recognize and fight for the possibility of a multicultural social democracy as an alternative to the right-wing version of anti-neoliberalism. And I guess if I were even more naive, I would hope for such a thing in the Harris administration. But to me, that seems like an unlikely vehicle for such a politics. All right. Thank you. I'm happy to take your questions.
Big thank you to Professor Hartman, and we already have some questions.
Hang on a second while I get the mic up the stairs.
Hello, Andrew, and thank you so much for your talk. I remember some semesters ago where we read your book across the course, and I was very enamored by it. One thing that I kept wishing to see was a mention of specifically the right-wing pipeline, especially prominent on social media such as YouTube, where speakers such as Son of Akkad, Amazing Atheist, or maybe more known names such as Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson were very prominent in pushing this anti-SJW dogma. And I was kind of wondering if this right-wing pipeline was a thing you or your peers talk about or consider as being some sort of some kind of an, what should we call it, amplifying a lot of the social culture wars that we see Trump repeating now.
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, you're right. I didn't deal with that in my book, mostly because, as you, I assume, know, the book, it's mostly about the sort of like how the 60s served as a bridge to the 80s and 90s. And I think you saw similar pipelines on the right at that time period, but that they've since taken on a life of their own in sort of like a social media ecosphere. I want to agree with you and say that the right-wing social media environment creates a sort of context that amplifies Trump's message, but that also, I think, has informed and shaped his message. And so, especially amongst young men, and so I guess this would sort of emphasize one of the points of Laura's presentation about the gender gap in terms of political ideology. There's been wide appeal. Like, I think that masculinity in a sort of like neoliberal multicultural context that is feminist, at least in rhetoric, if not in practice, masculinity has been threatened to the degree that lots of young men feel like they have no place. And this has created a vacuum for these right-wing people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, the list goes on and on. So yeah, I recognize the problem and I think about it historically. I don't necessarily have a solution except insofar as if you look at polling data amongst the working class, the people in the working class who are reliably Democratic voters and who either support or downplay the culture war, support the left side of the culture wars or downplay them, as significant in terms of voting behavior are those who are unionized. And so the more that we can do to enhance unionization and a sort of like left-wing labor politics, to me, that's the only sort of thing we can do to de-amplify this right-wing pipeline that you refer to.
All right, thank you, Professor Hartman. Is there any other question from the room? I thought I saw a hand somewhere. Doesn't seem to be. I'm going to hand the mic over to, oh, you have a comment. Okay, here you go.
Hi, I actually just want to thank you because I was under the impression that this election was a cult of personality war. And that was the only thing I was seeing. And
keep the mic up to you.
Oh, sorry. So I want to thank the three of you for kind of broadening, my understanding of what's really going on, that there's a lot more at play, that actually this, as you put it, extends really more to a cultural war taking place, that this is actually bigger than the candidates themselves. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. Glad to help. I mean, the cult of personality really does matter, and perhaps more than ever. But the question I always ask myself is, okay, so I hope to be alive 25 years from now, writing and thinking about the current election and current politics, and what am I going to be thinking about? And I hope and think I'll be thinking about longer term historical patterns than I will about the cult of personality, even though the cult of personality has a particular historical valence that I think I sort of addressed in the sense that Trump can only a Trump phenomenon is made possible by a particular moment, and that includes his cult of personality. But yes, I think other historical forces are more important for sure.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Hartman. Thank you so much, Professor Browder, and also thanks to Professor Haberski, who has left now. Thank you, everyone. We should give them a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're now reaching the closing of this event. So I just want to say a couple of thanks. Again, we thank the US Embassy and SDU for making this event possible. We thank all the speakers, including our three former Fulbright distinguished chairs, E.J. Dionne, David Woolner, Carolyn Jefferson Jenkins, Niels Eichhorn, and Niels Bjerre Poulsen. And we'd like to thank you for being here, and we'd like to thank co-organizer Sabine Ansbjerg, like to thank Johanna Laura Beres, we'd like to thank Helena Korton Møller and Sebastian Erlandsen, and also Maria Denise Christoffersen and Izzy Ambrosova for doing all this incredible work to make this event happen. Thank you so much. And thus, the event has closed.
Thank you so much, Laura and Andrew. I would say get home safe, but I assume that you are. But thank you for joining us on this webinar. We're going to close it down now, okay?
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.